Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's workshop titled Making Access to Psychedelic-Assisted Psychotherapy Legal. We are lucky to be joined today by two individuals who have been on the front line of trying to make that a reality in Canada. Before I briefly introduce our speakers, a quick reminder to all attendees that there'll be time for a Q&A after their talks. Please submit your questions in the Whova Q&A rather than the Zoom function, and I'll be sure to monitor those and ask if we have some time remaining. So first, we are joined by David Wood. David is a lawyer, a patent agent, practicing as both a general counsel and chief legal officer at Haichin Industries, and through his solo legal practice, Our Group Legal. Haichin is a contract development and manufacturing organization focused on GMP manufacturing of psychedelics, and Our Group Legal is David's intellectual property, regulatory, and commercial legal practice. In addition to other clients in psychedelics and cannabis, Our Group Legal provides pro bono support to Therapsil, a nonprofit that has been successful in supporting dozens, hundreds of Canadians in applications for exemptions to possess and consume psilocybin for therapeutic purposes or to train in psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy. At both Haichin and Our Group Legal, David provides practical advice informed by his PhD in structural biochemistry, and David's education in chemistry and biochemistry provide a strong technical background for advising clients working with psychedelics and clients working in the cannabis industry in relation to both intellectual property and regulatory law. Second but not least, we are joined by Spencer Hawkswell. Spencer is the CEO of Therapsil and is a registered lobbyist and patients' right advocate. Therapsil is a coalition of healthcare professionals, patients, and advocates dedicated to fighting for the rights of Canadians facing end-of-life or illness-related distress to have compassionate access to psilocybin therapy. Spencer was first introduced to healing psychological trauma with altered states of consciousness from reading the work of Terence McKenna, Rick Strassman, and Carl Jung, and believes that these methods need to be treated seriously by governments and institutions. Spencer believes that responsible drug policy requires effective organization and leadership and is dedicated to bringing together the experts and advocates to facilitate change that results in increased access to compassionate care, harm reduction, and treatment options for those in need. Thank you for joining us, Spencer and David. David will start by speaking first. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Really happy to be here. So I prepared a short presentation and I will get that going now. Is my, just second, there we go. The slideshow should be visible. Is it visible? Okay, great. So yeah, I've just decided to title the short presentation, Access to Psychedelics, Looking Around and Looking Forward, because that's what we're doing. I'd like to tell all the listeners how psychedelic access works in Canada today and where we'd like to see it go in the future. And I'm gonna try and keep this, I'm aiming to end between 10 and 15 minutes after I start. I am, as Michael mentioned, a lawyer and patent agent, and I run my own practice called Our Group Legal, in addition to my work with Haichin. As with any legal summary, it's important to stress this is not legal advice. This is just a general description of the law, and that it's critical that if anyone's interested in working with psychedelics in any way, it's very important to engage counsel that are able to advise on it. This is basically the only slide we're going to look at. It's really the only substantive slide in the deck. So in Canada, like with most countries, we are party to United Nations Drug Control Conventions, which started in 1961, as I'm sure a lot of people watching know, with opiates, cocaine, and cannabis being scheduled. And then in 1971, second convention was signed on by most of the participants in the 1961 convention, which added essentially all the classical psychedelics that we're all familiar with to the list of controlled substances that the UN conventions were encouraging countries and member states to prohibit. Now, one of the fundamental requirements of UN drug control conventions is that the countries must prohibit possession of any controlled substance. And by controlled substance, I'm referring to the original list of narcotics, as they were called, as well as the second list of psychotropic substances, as they were called, which would include psilocybin, LSD, mescaline, and similar drugs. And that's where we are today in Canada. So psychedelic drugs, the majority of the classical ones, are controlled substances. Now, I really try and stay away from using language like drugs are illegal. They're not illegal. There's no such thing as an illegal drug in Canada. Murder and treason are illegal. Those are uncategorically activities that are unlawful in all circumstances. Controlled substances, on the other hand, while they're often referred to as illegal, they're not. They're simply controlled substances. And controlled substances are subject to specific regulation. Now, the perception that controlled substances are illegal comes from the fact that, consistent with our UN obligations, Canada has prohibited all, and this is in the red box that outlines the entire framework here. You can see, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but it says CDSA up here at the top. And I'll just read what the slide says there. All possession, trafficking, import, export, and production of controlled substances are prohibited, subject to authorizations to do so. Now, that's what I mean by these are not illegal. These are substances that you need authorizations to work with. And there's a few different types of authorizations that exist in Canada. And we'll start with what's probably the simplest case, and which does not include any psychedelics at all, but does include things like amphetamines or barbiturates or anabolic steroids or other controlled substances that people can be prescribed. And if you look down at the purple magenta boxes, you'll see that there's a verb there called commercial sale. Now, if a drug product has been approved for sale to the market and it's been given a drug identification number, or DIN, then it can be prescribed by a healthcare practitioner, and then a pharmacy can dispense the drug to the person it's been prescribed to, and they can have the controlled substance for their therapeutic purpose. For example, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, it will commonly result in a prescription for methylphenidate or various amphetamine-based drugs, all of which are controlled, but are being possessed lawfully. Now, we'll back right up to, and Michael, I'm not sure, can my mouse cursor be seen by the audience?
Yes, it can, David.
Okay, good. So going back to what we're actually speaking about here, which is psychedelics, there's probably two concepts that everyone's heard of that, in terms of how patients can get access. One of those is the Special Access Program in Canada, which is regulated under Part C of the Food and Drug Regulations, which is this orange box. The other one is not so much access, I wouldn't really call it that, I'd more call it permission to possess, which is the subsection 56.1 exemption right here, a CDSA exemption. So in Canada, right now, there are two ways that a person can, in compliance with the law, use a psychedelic drug therapeutically. And Therapsil has had success in both of these methods. One of them, and it's the one that has the least relevance today, but was the one that Therapsil's success began with, and that is a subsection 56.1 exemption. So that's right up here, CDSA exemption. Now, to the left of that, you'll see something called a dealer's license, which allows manufacture of whatever controlled substances are listed on the license. At Scigen, we're authorized to manufacture LSD, MDMA, psilocybin, psilocin, mescaline, and 2CB. We also have manufactured 5-methoxy-DMT and ibogaine, neither of which are controlled in Canada, as well as a number of other substances that I'm not able to identify on this talk. But that's what a dealer's license does. And there are three different regulations that are really relevant here. The narcotic control regulations, which you'd need to work with, say, ketamine. The food and drug regulations, Part G, which I would not say really include any psychedelic drugs, but that's where things like amphetamines and non-benzodiazepine sedatives are. And then FDRJ, which is where all these psychedelic drugs are scheduled. A lot of people have heard phrases like Schedule 1. Canada has a Schedule 1, 2, 3, and 4 for controlled substances, but they don't mean the same things they do in the United States. The closest thing that we have to the meaning of Schedule 1 in the United States would be a restricted drug. And Part J of the Food and Drug Regulations is the regulation under which restricted drugs can be worked with as a licensed dealer. So backing up to how a patient gets access, under an exemption, it would have nothing to do with a dealer's license. It would be essentially they would get permission to possess through their CDSA exemption, and then they would be forced to source their material from an illicit source. Now, the only exemptions I've seen that Therapsil has obtained to give permission to individuals to use a controlled substance are with psilocybin. And psilocybin makes sense because it is a substance that you can readily identify psilocybin mushroom. The chance that the psilocybin mushroom is contaminated, for example, with carfentanil, is very, very low. And it's, I'd say, got kind of an inherent safety to it, because typically if someone's going to use 5 grams of psilocybin mushrooms for a breakthrough psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy session, it's going to be pretty hard to overdose in an extreme way or to underdose, right? The material is bulky enough and hard enough to ingest that it's got sort of an inherent safety in terms of it being very, very difficult to unintentionally eat too many mushrooms. And I think probably most people on the call can understand that. So that, I believe, is part of why there is some comfort at Health Canada with giving an exemption. That's my own conjecture. It's just sort of my theory of the rationale here. And it does make sense for the reasons I just stated. Now, the chart is set up to show the more normal situation of dealer makes drug, dealer sends to researcher who holds an exemption, holds an authorization under Part J of the FDR. It's just a different form you got to fill out. And as I wrote up here, this does not require GMP as long as it's used in animals, in vitro, or in tissue culture. To use a drug in humans in a clinical trial, we have to be within the Food and Drug Regulations Part C. Part C of the Food and Drug Regulations regulates drug products. And it's under that part of the Food and Drug Regulations that the Special Access Program has been legislated. The Special Access Program was designed for, say, rare cancer drugs. There's a type of cancer that maybe only affects 100 people globally a year. It's entirely possible that drug's not available in Canada because the market's too small. However, if a physician has a patient where they've exhausted all available remedies or ruled them out, and they have evidence that a drug will work for their patient, then they can request special access. Now, if a rare cancer drug is approved in Japan and the United Kingdom and the United States, but not Canada, and it's on market in those countries, and it's being prescribed on label for a life-threatening condition, that would have a very high chance of success in the Special Access Program. January 5th, 2022, the Special Access Program was opened up to psychedelics, which were previously excluded from it. In fact, Scigen supplied the first psilocybin ever used in that program for some patients that had end-of-life distress, which was a very rewarding moment in my career that we actually got to put that into someone's hands. And it was through donation, and it was an individual working with Therapsil. So it was, again, very nice to see that succeed. But as it says in the chart, if you're in the Food and Drug Regulations Part C, drug products must be manufacturing compliance with GMP. And if you want to get a drug identification number, you have to do clinical trials, which are shown here. And at the conclusion of successful clinical trials, a drug will be given a drug identification number, which means it can be prescribed. To be prescribed, it would have to be manufactured in a facility that has a dealer's license, as well as a drug establishment license. That's why there's two concentric boxes here. And anytime you're talking about controlled substances, just to remind everyone, you're within the red box of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, which again means by default possession is prohibited. But if you have authorization, for example, through special access program, through an exemption, or through a prescription for a drug that has a DIN, then possession is fine. There is provincial legislation that will apply to the practice of medicine. It's probably well known at this point that Alberta has regulations specific to psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. That would be an example of these purple boxes that would allow use of the drug under certain circumstances. Now, my chart breaks down a little for special access program. I'll confess I didn't update it since the last time I used it, and I probably ought to before the next time, because what we need is a box that shows a dealer's license, but no drug establishment license, sending an arrow down here through the special access program. But I want to stress that the special access program is just that. It's special access. It's when all other methods have been tried and failed or ruled out. And it's really the only option the physician has left to help their patient. It's not intended, and nor do I think it's appropriate for it to serve the role of a generalized access to something. And that's why with Therapsil, Therapsil with me rather, they're leading it, I'm just supporting it. We've drafted regulations very similar to the cannabis regulations that would fit on top of a Food and Drug Part G license. And with our proposed regulations, psilocybin and psilocin would be moved from Part J as restricted drugs to Part G as controlled drugs. And then a second license would stack on top of that, dealer's license under Part G. And that second license looks a lot like a cannabis processing license. It would authorize the turning of psilocybin mushrooms or pure synthetic psilocybin or psilocin into products a lot like cannabis products that would come in a box that would say how much not THC, in this case, psilocybin is in the product. There'd probably be some sort of warning label, and then batch and lot numbers, date, packaged, etc. With that type of product, you could have production standards, you could have safety and labeling, and you could have a predictable product to put into people's hands. Much like the SAP, except in this case, the physician would be able to say, I want my patient to have this drug, so I'm doing the paperwork, and then my patient will have the product. Right now, if a physician decides their patient would benefit from psilocybin, the physician must ask a bureaucrat for permission to treat their patient as they see fit. And at Therapsil, and me personally on top of Therapsil's position, feel quite strongly that this is inappropriate and that it really should be up to a physician and not a bureaucrat to decide whether a given individual should have access to a treatment, and it should be up to the physician at what stage that treatment is introduced. Spencer can talk more about this, but we saw a recent example where a physician, very reputable, experienced physician, wanted his patient to have psilocybin therapy to overcome alcoholism, and there's much evidence that works. And unfortunately, Health Canada was of the view that that patient ought to try electroconvulsive therapy first. Now, that is an alarming response and one the physician did not agree with. Thankfully, when Therapsil published this information, Health Canada very quickly allowed the special access. But we would really like to see a situation where it's entirely the physician's choice and no kind of public shaming of the regulator is necessary in order for a patient to access the therapy. And with that, I'll hand it over to Spencer and just say thank you. My email address is there. I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn, and I love talking about this topic. I will go on mute now, and I look forward to hearing what Spencer has to say.
Wonderful. I can just jump in here. So yeah, thank you very much for having me to participate in this discussion here. David, that was very, very thorough. And I actually think this sets me up quite well to speak about how a lot of, these Section 56 exemptions and SAP exemptions got approved and where we think it's going with these medical regulations. Now, again, I'm a lobbyist advocate and I run Therapsil. So a lot of the work that I do is more focused on overcoming regulations, working within existing regulations, and trying to develop new ones in order to help patients. And so first and foremost, I'll state I'm not a doctor or therapist, but I am a Canadian that understands our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And I got associated with Therapsil in 2019 when I saw a patient and doctor taking the government of Canada to court in order to assert that that patient and their doctor and therapist had the right to use psilocybin to treat their end-of-life distress. Now, this was a patient who in Canada had the right to die ever since our medical assistance in dying regulations came about in 2016. And so you can imagine how that might change the landscape in Canada. And it certainly did right after 2016 when this patient found out they had cancer, when they had read some of the papers that had come out of Johns Hopkins and NYU and thought to themselves, well, if I have the right to die, shouldn't I have the right to try something like psilocybin? I believe this is important in noting because at no point here do we ever assert that the clinical evidence around psilocybin is where it ought to be to bring a drug to Canada. The process to bringing any approved drug to Canada is it has to go through clinical trials. And that's how it's usually done about 99.9% of the time. There are exceptions, of course, and I think that looking at COVID was a perfect example of how when in an emergency, the government can make some changes and do things a bit differently, either speeding up or changing the process by which drugs come to market through their clinical trials. But in general, things go through clinical trial. Now, other than COVID, another great examples of things that didn't go that route were cannabis and medical assistance in dying. Both cannabis and medical assistance in dying were granted to patients because of their inherent charter right. Now, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was written by Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, for those of you who don't know. And this charter is really the basis of the law in Canada, the basis of our rights. And over the course of the last couple of years, there have been many different court cases which have shown how patients can use these charter rights, specifically Charter 7 rights that stipulate our right to life, liberty, and security of person to get access to medical treatments. And so medical assistance in dying was a great example of that. Cannabis was a great example of that, where the courts decided that it was actually within the patient's right to be able to make their own medical choices, along with the doctor to be able to support those patients with their right to make medical decisions to take cannabis for their treatments. And that is even though there may not be sufficient research to allow for drugs there. And I think we can all certainly understand that medical assistance in dying is also not available because we've done a bunch of research on it, but rather because we have a right. And so that's why we absolutely knew when we started Therapsil back in 2019, that similarly psilocybin would become available for the same Section 7 rights. So I jumped on to support the court case, but we also saw that back in the early 2000s, through Section 56, which David had talked about, cancer patients were actually getting access to cannabis. And again, that was in the late 90s and early 2000s under the leadership of our Canadian Health Minister, Alan Rock at the time. And so we decided to exercise the exact same model and put patients through Section 56, asking for permission. And after about 100 days of advocating and lobbying, putting intense pressure on the government, we were able to see those exemptions get passed. And we were able to start moving towards treatment. And again, this was at a time where there was even less research than there is now. But nonetheless, I think with the threat of court and seeing that these patients were in quite a precarious position where the only option they had left was medical assistance in dying, our minister at the time, Patty Haichin, actually granted these compassionately. Now, we also around the same time made 19 more requests for doctors, therapists, and nurses, 19 of them, to get access to psilocybin to use in our Therapsil training program. And that was also granted. And the argument that we made was any healthcare practitioner or at least therapist who's providing cognitive behavioral therapy, internal family systems therapy, even massage therapy, it's generally accepted that the therapist themselves first goes through the therapy. And this has been around for a long time. I think there are multiple reasons for it. First and foremost, doing the work on yourself first is often necessary as to reduce the risk of transference so that you're not, putting some trauma or some disorder onto another patient. And similarly, it also helps to build a bit of empathy so the patient has trust that you've been through it, you know what it's like. And then, of course, for your own professional development and practice, you should probably know what's going on through the patient's head. Now, this was the argument we made, and it's been made many times. Something that one of our doctors famously says, and I love it, is science is science, and protocols are protocols. And back in the 1950s, when psilocybin was not yet made illegal or as heavily prohibited as it is now, there was a lot of science that was being done in Canada, and these were the generally accepted principles. I believe at one point it was even said by the producer of psilocybin, Sandoz, I believe it is, that it would be unethical for therapists not to take the substance before they gave it to their patients. And so making this argument, we proposed that to Health Canada too, and they approved it. Now, all of this changed when Patty Haichin, our Minister of Health, left office in 2021 and was replaced by not one, but two health ministers, Health Minister Jean-Yves Duclos and Caroline Bennett. And it seems like Minister Haichin, as she was transitioning out of that role, had made the amendments that David had mentioned to the special access program. And when the new health ministers came in, they decided that they would no longer grant any Section 56 exemptions. And that's not a written policy. That's just a decision they seem to have made. And instead, they would push everything through the special access program. Now, again, as David said, that program was designed originally for some cancer drugs that were perhaps not available in Canada, but had some data, and you would use it to get special access. It's not a good system for helping patients access something more generally. And that it has been very well proven in the case of cannabis, where there was a move away from that. Anything considered special, I believe that it was actually Section 56 that they were using towards a proper regulatory system that would help patients get access. So we've been exercising this SAP program, but it's been far from helpful and useful for both patients and healthcare practitioners. I think one of the biggest challenges with the SAP is certainly the amount of paperwork necessary, and then also the risk that is put on not only the healthcare provider, being the therapist, but also the doctor who's writing the SAP. Like most drugs you're giving to a patient, you can usually watch them, they'll take it, and you're there to administer it as a doctor. But with psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, you're often taking part in a treatment that is really more between the patient and the therapist. And so having a system where the doctor is now in charge of something that they're not doing, such as the provision of therapy, it certainly has scared off a lot of doctors, left a lot of unanswered questions around practice, malpractice, along with what's being insured. And not to mention that because of all of the red tape here, there have been many patients who have died waiting to get access, and many others that have been unable to afford the psilocybin therapy, given all of the red tape and people and person power it takes to get through this system. I can personally say that I've also seen the special access program kind of like the Section 56, acting a bit like a changing goalpost. In the beginning, it seemed like they were granting these for patients who had the support of a doctor, who were palliative or had treatment-resistant depression, until all of a sudden we got a note back to one of the doctors saying, "You've done too many treatments, and too many successful treatments at that. We would like to see you move towards clinical trials." And clinical trials is really the only other way patients have to get access, if not through Section 56 and SAP. But we've made many assertions many times that it's actually unethical to be forcing people to go through a clinical trial when there is no question. And certainly in the case of these patients, it wasn't about a question being asked, it was about providing an emergency treatment for people who are suffering from a terrible condition, end-of-life distress. So we've had to put in a bunch of work to try and to combat the letters and response that we're getting from the SAP office. And it's been very distressful for patients too, who know that they'll never get through a clinical trial, and as well as the healthcare practitioners that know that they don't have the time or funds to conduct a clinical trial. Now, there are also other instances, as David had mentioned, where patients are being asked to do electroconvulsive therapy before getting access, because this is what the Canadian medical guidelines suggest. A patient must try SSRIs or have a clinical contraindication to that. Same would go for things like retinal transmagnetic stimulation or electroconvulsive therapy. And that has been a major challenge for both doctors and patients to overcome, often involving hours and hours and hours, sometimes days and weeks of work just to show that either these treatments aren't available, that a patient is contraindicated, or that simply it won't work because of something like cost or the need to travel. So we really are in a bit of a predicament, and that's left us really with only one choice. And that is to continue to support as many patients as we can through these broken systems, while pushing forward a constitutional challenge. And the hope is that that constitutional challenge will force the government to put together some form of regulations. Now, this is not the best route. It's never good to have a government scrambling to get regulations together on their heels. It would be much better if the government would come forward and meet with us and determine what regulations best fit, Canada and the Canadians and healthcare practitioners looking for access. And that's what David and I do very much on a day-to-day within Therapsil, and what we did last week in Ottawa when we went to go meet with different policymakers, the ministers of health and MPs. But our hope is that we may very, very soon, within the next year or two, get to a point where we have medical regulations a lot like those for cannabis, where doctors are able to write medical documents to get patients access to psilocybin, either psilocybin that they can grow themselves, designated grower, or purchase from a manufacturer or licensed producer. And that's really where we want to get to in Canada. You don't need to be a lawyer or doctor or a government policymaker to understand that in Canada, many, many times we've used these charter rights to get people access to medicines on the basis of their charter rights. And in this situation, it's no different. With a certain degree of certainty, we know that it's not a matter of if, but when and how. And we really want to see, these changes made very soon, because as some of you may be aware, the medical assistance in dying guidelines are changing. They've made some amendments and are expanding it to include patients who have mental illness, such as treatment-resistant depression or mood disorders. And this would really be quite a travesty in Canada if there were patients and healthcare practitioners being told that because they're treatment-resistant, unable to seek relief from any of the available treatments, that they're now being granted access to medical death. The problem is that they have not tried all treatments. The government is in fact withholding treatments such as psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy from them, leaving them with only the choice of medical assistance in dying. And this is really what we're fighting to change. We have about 350 healthcare practitioners who have done our intensive training, who have patients that they have sent to us to support through this process. And many of those patients are going on to become the plaintiffs and to add to the evidence of how they're being wronged by Health Canada. We really believe that there's no reason that the ministers of health can't jump in and, with the signature of their pen, grant these patients either exemptions or hopefully move to regulations that will solve for a safe supply and a regulated system that gives the country more transparency into how the medicine is being provided. But what we certainly don't want to see is the government ignore patients. And that's kind of where we're at today. And really where Therapsil finds itself is not only being a training organization, an advocacy organization, but also one that's having to challenge the government and change the laws in Canada. So at present, we're still fighting for patients who are trying to get Section 56 access. I know David had said in his presentation that this one hasn't been granted in a while, but we really do believe through what's called mandamus. I won't get too deep into what that is, but more or less it means we're going to try and compel the government to make a decision on these exemptions, that we'll be able to reopen those and to provide immediate relief for patients and healthcare practitioners who are using psilocybin in treatment and training. But in addition to that, through our court case, we'll want to see regulations come about as soon as possible. I'll finish there because I assume, Michael, that we've got a bit of time for questions. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. We have about 20 minutes now.
Wonderful.
So yeah, thank you, David and Spencer, for the comprehensive rundown of regulations in Canada and for your work and Therapsil's history involved in pushing the front lines of access to psilocybin therapy in Canada. Jane, you can confirm that there are no questions so far, but that's okay. I have several questions ready. So I guess I'll start with Spencer. You briefly mentioned Therapsil's trip to Ottawa recently. I'm curious if you could tell us a bit more about what the goals there were and what you feel has been accomplished thus far, and what are the plans moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. The goals of the trip were to meet with the ministers of health and to seek immediate exemptions for the patients and healthcare practitioners who had been waiting, some of them up to 420 days for access to medicine. In some cases, those patients and healthcare practitioners had been given psilocybin exemptions back in 2020. So for them, they knew it worked. It wasn't a matter of if, it was, this is absolutely effective. It was well documented. And so we wanted relief for them. In addition, we wanted to set a precedent for being able to grant future exemptions because our organization almost on a daily basis is meeting with different patients who are in this, this circumstance where they've tried everything else and will soon be eligible for things like medical assistance in dying, yet be told that they cannot try psilocybin. So that's something that we believe needed to be reconciled with immediately. And we wanted to do that two ways, by meeting with different policymakers and Liberal MPs. We met with a ton of them from every party. And it was very, very well, we were very well accepted and received. I think many people agreed with this notion that if you have the right to die, you should have the right to try. And there was a lot of interest in the regulations that we had made. And even more interest in meeting up again in the new year. But unfortunately, we wanted to speak with the minister and bring patients and healthcare practitioners to them. But the ministers of health completely ignored these patients, completely ignored the doctors who protested outside their offices out front Parliament Hill. And they didn't even respond to us in person. So it was a bit upsetting, but it's advocacy, right? If you think about the way the government works, it really is a PR company. And there are tons of important things happening in Canada every day, but unless your issue becomes newsworthy, it's unlikely that anybody's going to pay any attention to it. So the most important thing was gathering a bit of attention and some news, and we did that very successfully.
Well, that's great to hear, and yeah, wishing you luck with the continued advocacy.
Thank you.
David, you had briefly talked about upcoming regulatory changes, specifically in Alberta. I'm curious if you could tell us a bit more about that and whether you think they'll function to increase accessibility or work against it.
Yeah, so essentially the Alberta regulations, and again, these are provincial. So just kind of federalism 101, there's some stuff the federal government can do, there's some stuff the provincial government can do. And the law is set up to avoid overlap. So the federal government has to decide whether or not a controlled substance can be accessed. And right now that's special access program or subsection 56.1. However, once that product is in the hands of a physician, what happens from that point forward would be subject to provincial law. Provincial law would include whatever law gives the physician their license to practice medicine and the codes of conduct and ethical standards they have to comply with to keep that license. It can also include, as is the case in Alberta now, additional regulation on the activity of delivering psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. The regulation includes a broader term. Actually, if anyone's really interested in this, on my LinkedIn, I published 2 very descriptive articles. One is overview, one is more detailed. And in that, I use the actual correct legislative terms. I might not use the correct terms here, but generally, psychedelic services need a license. The license can be held by a clinic, as long as the clinic has a medical director who is a psychiatrist. Other physicians can practice at the clinic, but they must practice in association with a psychiatrist. That could be the medical director or a different psychiatrist, or they must themselves be a psychiatrist in order to prescribe psychedelics. Psychotherapists and other healthcare practitioners of that nature, of course, can be part of it. That is in the legislation as well. Clinical trials are not subject to these requirements, which is good. Clinical trials can continue, no problem. But any practice of medicine or psychotherapy with psilocybin, MDMA, or any other drug obtained through the Special Access Program would be subject to these laws, as would use of psilocybin obtained through an with the blessing of an exemption. Just as a quick aside, it's impossible for an exemption to allow sourcing from a regulated source. I don't want to say why, it would just take too long, but that is the case. Special access must be from a regulated source, which is why a lot more physicians are comfortable with it. And then you asked whether this regulation will allow or restrict access. I don't know. Now, I am somewhat involved with this. I'm allowed to say that. I can't really say anything else. So I will avoid really expressing a strong opinion on this, but I actually think that's a blessing and not a dodge, because it's for people to make their own minds up. The fact is, when you regulate, 2 things necessarily happen. You increase the barrier to access, and you apply conditions to the service or product being provided. So if the conditions that are applied to the service being provided are good ones that actually increase the value, and if the barrier to access to provide the service is appropriate such that it increases the quality of a service, but without limiting it too much, then you're threading the needle and balancing those competing interests correctly. Because on the one hand, if you had no rules at all, there'd be irresponsible use of psychedelics, which would be a problem. And I personally do not feel this way, but some people, and they're not like it's a rational viewpoint, believe that medical cannabis was abused for the sake of easy access. While they're very, very different because of cultural phenomena, people associate psychedelics with cannabis, so they immediately think of that when they think of a psilocybin medical access system. However, I think everyone in listening to this probably knows that very few people are going to go through psychotherapy in order to get their hands on some mushrooms. That's a bit extreme, especially when they're so easily available illicitly. So that's one consideration that I think is a bit of a red herring, that it's on all of us to help educate really whoever we talk to about on this point, that medical access to psilocybin will not be as open, liberal, and unsupervised as medical access to cannabis, simply because of the way the material is used. And then on the other hand, so you got to balance avoiding irresponsible access by having too few qualifiers on the service. You also have to avoid unduly limiting access by having too many qualifiers. Where does the Alberta regulation fall? That really depends on your perspective. And I've talked to people who heavily value each side of that teeter-totter. So there are standards that apply to these regulations that have not published yet. I think the content of those standards would be something you'd have to have in front of you before you can really start judging the regulations. And also, we all know this, regulations tend to start more restrictive and become more liberal. Tobacco is one of the only cases and I suppose drugs in general go over decades, but typically in a modern context, regulations go in the direction of less regulation, not more. So it shouldn't be that surprising that it starts out quite restrictive while we figure it out, because psychedelics can cause harm. I personally feel like they're relatively low risk, but I think that's because the examples I've seen have been physicians that know what they're doing. If this turned into something that could just be a money-making ploy for a physician that is not properly trained, although I struggle to see how that would work, then harm would result. So again, I think time will tell on whether or not these regulations are a good thing for patients and physicians or not.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for that helpful context. I guess we'll have to wait and see once those go into effect next year, and there are other changes that precipitate their relevance. So you brought up, I guess, potential harms. And there's an increasing focus on the safety of these therapies. I mean, yesterday, Health Canada put out a notice to stakeholders regarding risk management in clinical trials. So how is safety being approached outside of clinical trial settings, from Section 56 to the SAP, or even to your proposed regulations?
Want me to take that? Okay. I'll jump in and answer quick, because we do run a program where we train about we've trained over 350 healthcare practitioners, and safety. It's all about safety. That's why we created this community of practice. When we started off supporting patients through treatment, we were very clear to the government that we would use the same protocol and safety guidelines that were used in the original John Hopkins clinical trials. And since then, for obvious reasons, we've had to move away from those very, very strict protocols and guidelines. And the reason simply being that anytime you're doing a clinical trial, you're trying to operate in a vacuum, right? Control for as many variables as possible. And that's just not possible when you're moving into treatment. Too many patients have some mild contraindications. Too many patients are taking other drugs, whether they're SSRIs or other opioids, painkillers. That's just the way it is in healthcare, and I think every doctor and a healthcare professional knows this. But that being said, we still operate with protocols. We still have guidelines. We still have checklists. There are still best practices to be followed for every profession, whether you're a nurse doing the intakes and supporting patients as a sitter in some of the sessions, or the therapist running the psychotherapy sessions, or the physician. Consulting with pharmacists is very important sometimes, or with other experts in their field. We also believe that every healthcare practitioner should be operating within their scope of practice and not outside of that. So combating safety, every healthcare practitioner is very, very aware of how they're to do that. And we're very lucky in Canada to have well-trained professionals who are always considering risks and safety. We've built the entire program around that. But at the same time, I do have to say, life and healthcare is about taking risks, and there are some risks that are completely necessary. So when we look back at this idea again that we're operating outside of clinical trials, that's okay. We're allowed to do that. A lot of medicine is practiced off-label or outside of what it's been clinically tested for. But that's fine so long as there are best practices, so long as there is a community of practice and standards of care being followed, and that's what we do. So it is sometimes referred to as a gray area, but it doesn't have to be. Not if you've got a lot of practitioners all being trained and following guidelines. And when you are operating outside of, let's say, end of life or treatment-resistant depression, which has been happening, right? Many patients have used this for cluster headaches. Again, that's fine. But at the end of the day, it is up to the healthcare practitioner, to the doctor, and it is up to the patient. But in Canada, that needs to be a possibility. Otherwise, we would never, ever have any innovation outside of clinical trials, and that wouldn't serve anyone. So yeah, that's a bit about that. And if you have any specific questions about, safety around drug interventions, anything like that, I'm happy to answer what I can. But in general, again, there are some pharmacists and doctors who are far, far more knowledgeable on the subject than I am.
I think
Thanks
it's
for
also
that.
worth recognizing that psychedelics is a broad topic. Therapsil is very, very focused on psilocybin, but that has an extremely different risk profile than ketamine. And ketamine has different risk profiles depending on whether it's intranasal, intramuscular injection, or intravenous injection. And all of those are going to have very different interactions with other drugs. But I think a really succinct point is that most of these risks can be mitigated just by knowing which product it is, and that informs your decision on when to use it. And that's where underground therapy has a layer of risk that regulated therapy does not. And that's not a judgment, that's just a fact.
Jane, just to double check, I'm not missing any questions from the audience. If not, I'll keep going. Okay, great. So on that point about supply, David, I guess, have there been any supply issues with access to psilocybin since the switch to SAP from Section 56? And is that the reason that you might push for continued access through Section 56?
I know, so at SciGen, we've supplied the special access program, but we, just due to internal bandwidth issues, our ability to supply it was outpaced by the demand. However, I know another company called Filament has successfully and consistently supplied the special access program with an extracted psilocybin product. So I think the bottleneck is not, is there enough appropriate quality psilocybin in Canada? I think the bottleneck is you're asking a physician to do a lot of paperwork. They don't get paid for doing that. And then they get a frustrating maybe, and then more paperwork. And let's not forget that the waiting itself and the uncertainty, that's causing more harm to their patient, right? Because it's this, will I or won't I get this relief that my physician has recommended to me? I mean, try and put yourself in that situation, especially if you don't have much time left. So I think, to me, the bottleneck in access is permission. And then that just goes to, if the current system isn't designed for first resort, then maybe there should be a different system. Because I think we can do better with psilocybin specifically than just saying, wait for a product to receive a DIN. And we've seen it with cannabis products. It could be very similar. Cannabis products differ from drug products in that they don't say, this is for a headache, this is for nausea, this is for, right? It can't say that. It just says THC, CBD, weight, that's it. Packaging date. Those are the critical things. A psilocybin product could be the same. And I'll just end that line of thinking with the idea that we're not trying to kill tumors with exact doses of a toxic drug. We're trying to make sure someone gets to a certain point or higher, not too much higher, but at least a minimum certain point where the neuroplasticity and the psychotherapy just work better. So I think there is an argument that for that kind of medical practice, if you're giving someone mushrooms because they believe that'll help them better than a synthetic, or vice versa, if they're scared of a mushroom and they want a synthetic, I think that impression from the patient has to affect outcome necessarily. And since the goal is more effective psychotherapy, I just think we can help more Canadians for a lower dollar value sooner with a medical access program than with only prescription drugs, particularly since we already know how to regulate consumer packaged goods that have an active ingredient but have no health indication. We've had tons of practice with that, with cannabis.
Yeah, that's a great point. And on the specific point about patients and the suffering that comes with waiting, I'm curious to ask about Thomas Hardle, who was one of your first successful Section 56 applicants for a terminal diagnosis. And as I understand it, he's been trying through the SAP unsuccessfully. So not to ask for you to speak on his behalf, but I'm curious about what his experience has been like as of late.
I'm happy to. Thomas was supposed to join David and I in Ottawa with the delegation of patients, terminally ill patients who were coming to the minister to say, "Minister, we're quite literally dying for access here, and you're withholding a treatment that works for us. You're the one withholding it." And he couldn't come because, like many other patients who are going through, chemotherapy, there's sometimes, other illnesses that you're susceptible to. And in this case, bad case of COVID or the flu, and it's that time of season. But, this just points out the ridiculousness of expecting cancer patients to have to march to Ottawa to demand access to their medicine. That's not okay in this country. Okay, that is wrong, and it is cruel and unusual. And every Canadian who sees that knows it and is able to identify that for what it is. And so I can very much say through my conversations with Thomas that that's been his experience, is sometimes he gets special access, and he has been able to get access to the special access program, but that's for, one dose. And in his experience, he needs about a dose every 6 to 12 months. I imagine, anybody with a terminal illness that might be a reasonable, dosage to have. But he can't keep doing that. Can't keep flying out to Vancouver Island to see his doctor to get the treatment. It's too expensive. It's too difficult. He should have access to psilocybin the way he had it originally in 2020, when he was able to procure his own supply and or grow it. That should be something he completely has a right to, the exact same way he grows his cannabis. So, the system has not been kind. It has not been fair. And that's why he's the lead plaintiff on the court case. And all of those documents will soon be very publicly available for everyone to read, so they can completely understand what his experience is, along with what the experience of the minister and bureaucrats who have been refusing him access the last 2 years has been. Those are certainly what I'm interested to hear about.
Yeah, I think we can all look forward to that case moving farther along, and I'm sure anyone listening will be, following that closely. I think we've run up on our time limit now. I see Jane nodding. So I just wanted to thank you both, Spencer and David, for joining us and keeping us up to date on all that's happening with psilocybin in Canada. And with that, we'll close this out. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.